November 24, 1997. Yamaichi Securities made a decision to shut itself down involuntarily. Its debt in nearly $30 billion. One of the largest financial failures in post-war Japan. But this wasn't just a collapse. It was the result of years of hidden losses. How did a firm this large fall apart? To understand that, we need to go back to the peak of Japan's economic bubble. In the 1980s, Japan stood at the top of the world. Its economy was the second largest right behind the United States. At one point, Japanese companies accounted for nearly 45% of global stock market value. It was an era defined by a single phrase: Japan as number one. December 1989. The final trading day of the year. The Nikkei index hit 38,957 yen, its all-time high. And that day marked the peak of Japan's long-running bubble economy. Around that time, a new trend began to emerge across the industry. It was based on specified money trusts, known in Japan as Eijo Token, a system where corporations handed over their funds to securities firms, giving them almost complete control over how the money was managed. In many cases, instead of investors or asset managers, it was the sales teams at securities firms managing the funds at their own discretion. This model spread rapidly across the financial industry. For Yamaichi, still trailing behind the Big Four, these corporate accounts became a way to fight back. Competition intensified. And soon as simply raising capital wasn't enough. Companies demanded returns that exceeded their borrowing costs. Guaranteed returns. So, a new tactic emerged. Securities firms began making promises quietly. We'll manage your funds at around a 20% annual return. Returns agreed in advance. Off the record. Unwritten. Illegal. These were illegally guaranteed returns. In Japan, this practice was known as ni-giri. It was illegal under Japan's securities laws. But at the time, it was everywhere. As a result, Yamaichi and many others in the industry turned to a deceptive tactic to postpone their losses. It was called tobashi. Here's how it worked. Just before the end of a fiscal year, a firm would sell its devalued securities, assets with massive unrealized losses, to another company, often at inflated prices. Then, after the new fiscal year began, they would buy them back. The losses never disappeared. They were simply moved. In these transactions, the price was not based on market value. Instead, it stayed close to the original purchase price recorded on the books. And securities firms acted as intermediaries, arranging these deals in the shadows. By trading at book value, instead of the collapsing market price, they could pretend the loss didn't exist. But it did. At its core, tobashi worked like this. First, Company A entrusted $100 million to a securities firm, Yamaichi. In return, Yamaichi guaranteed a 5% return. By the end of the fiscal year, the market had fallen. The value of the investment dropped by around 10%, down to $90 million. A loss. But instead of realizing it, the securities were sold to another company, Company B. Not at market value, but at $105 million. A price far above what they were worth. But the market kept falling. So they needed more time to wait for a recovery. And that's when a third company entered the picture. Company C. Yamaichi promised to buy the securities from Company C at $110 million and asked them to take over the position. And as tobashi was repeated again and again, something began to break down. No one knew whose loss it was anymore. Not even the people inside. The losses had nowhere to go. They kept drifting from one company to another. Inside the firm, This state had a name: spacewalk. Losses, floating without gravity. But at the time in Japan, there was a widespread belief that economic growth would simply continue. Even without clear grounds, many assumed the market would recover. That if given enough time, stock prices would rise again. This optimism spread throughout the industry. And at Yamaichi, Tobashi was no longer isolated. It became an organized practice, carried out across the firm. December 19. Investments and other strategies. But Yamaichi took another approach. It dealt with only a few small cases. Major accounts were left untouched. The problem was simply pushed forward. Among the big four, Yamaichi ranked last, feared losing clients through confrontation. So, instead of pushing back, it chose to wait, hoping the market would recover. A defensive choice, and the worst one. As a result, Tobashi, which had already begun, expanded rapidly after the market collapse of 1990. Losses at Yamaichi kept growing, and negotiations with clients became increasingly intense. Inside the firm, there was a document, a list, compiled by staff in the corporate division, under instructions from their superiors. The document laid it all out: how each client fund was categorized, and the status of ongoing negotiations. But what stood out were the terms used inside the firm. Jump. Evacuation. Evacuation with interest. Keep it going, endlessly. They were internal code, used to manage Tobashi, a glimpse into how the system the core of the organization. After the bubble burst, the Nikkei kept falling, sharp, relentless, and with it, Yamaichi's finances deteriorated rapidly. In June 1993, the Ministry of Finance conducted a routine inspection. What it found was serious. The firm's condition had become critical. Yamaichi was instructed to submit a management improvement plan. As the plan was being drafted, the firm was forced to take another look, not just at the numbers on the books, but at everything hidden beyond them. Losses held in paper companies, others hidden overseas. A comprehensive report was compiled. Bringing it all together, and in a headquarters meeting, based on that report, the truth finally surfaced. The total amount of hidden unrealized losses was approximately $6.3 billion. Overseas losses, losses within the trading division, non-performing assets, all of them had been moved into paper companies, treated as if they did not exist. At the time, these paper companies were managing the loss-laden securities by repeatedly trading them among themselves. Funds were circulated through Yamaichi, keeping the system alive. The Ministry of Finance requested a list of Yamaichi's key counterparties, but the list was filled with paper companies, names that couldn't be disclosed, fearing their off-balance sheet losses would be exposed. Yamaichi altered the document. The paper companies were removed, and the list was rewritten by hand. What they submitted was false, and with it, a reconstruction plan built on deception. The off-balance sheet losses remained hidden deliberately. The stopgap recovery plan did nothing. Yamaichi's financial condition continued to deteriorate. Costs kept rising. Personnel expenses, fixed overhead, driven by an unsustainable push for expansion. The strain only grew heavier. Its stock price kept falling year after year. By 1995, the deficits had become severe. Only then did a more drastic plan emerge. A sweeping restructuring, downsizing, and for the first time, a proposal to disclose the off-balance sheet losses. But by then, it was already too late. But the leadership hesitated. They feared what would happen if the hidden losses were exposed. A collapse in trust, market panic, and consequences for themselves. So under the direction of then-President Mickey, the plan was postponed once again. And then, the fiscal year ending March 1997, Yamaichi reported a net loss of $1.65 billion, the largest in its history. But the problem went beyond domestic losses. Massive losses had also been hidden overseas, and this would become the trigger for its voluntary shutdown. Between 1988 and 1993, Yamaichi established 4 offshore paper companies. These entities served as repositories for losses generated both in Japan and abroad, losses that were transferred, concealed, and managed as off-balance sheet debt. The causes of Yamaichi's off-balance sheet losses overseas can be broken down into 4 main categories. First, loss compensation for clients, around $250 million. Second, unrealized losses from bond trading within Yamaichi's fixed income division, roughly $630 million. Third, losses incurred by Yamaichi's overseas subsidiaries, about $60 million. And fourth, profits artificially generated to support reported earnings, around $20 million. In total, the valuation losses reached approximately $1 billion. Roughly 40% of Yamaichi's off-balance sheet liabilities were held overseas. And within those, losses from proprietary trading accounted for nearly 75%. Overall, proprietary trading losses made up about 27% of Yamaichi's total hidden liabilities. It's often assumed that these off-balance sheet losses came mainly from compensating clients. But that wasn't the whole story. A significant portion came from losses generated internally through trading. Losses driven by weak risk management. And inside the organization, governance had effectively collapsed. In July 1997, Yamaichi Securities was raided. Authorities launched a criminal investigation over illegal payments to corporate racketeers known in Japan as Koike. The public reaction was immediate. Fierce criticism over the ties between the securities industry and the underworld. As a result, the old leadership, including the chairman and the president, stepped down. They had overseen years of hidden losses. A new president was appointed, Shohei Nozawa, an outsider with no ties to the past. And then, just 6 days after taking office, Nozawa was confronted with the truth. The scale of the hidden losses. The total losses were around $6 billion. Of that, roughly $2.6 billion had been hidden overseas and off the books. When Nozawa was briefed, he was stunned, overwhelmed. He reportedly collapsed into his chair, unable to stand for a while. A secret task force was formed, immediately centered around Nozawa. Its mission was simple: to disclose the losses, process them all at once, and rebuild the company. But reality was far harsher. Even after Nozawa took office, the crisis continued. Following the investigation by the special prosecutors, the case of illegal payments to corporate racketeers was confirmed. 8 executives from Yamaichi, including former President Miki, were arrested. From that moment, market confidence collapsed. The stock price kept falling. Clients began pulling out, one after another. Cash flow tightened day by day. And yet, Nozawa kept searching for a way to rebuild. In October, Yamaichi turned to its main bank, Fuji Bank, for urgent support. At the same time, it began exploring alliances with foreign firms. Talks were held in secret with Credit Suisse, Merrill Lynch, and ING Group, but none of them reached an agreement. And while those talks were underway, Moody's caught wind of Yamaichi's hidden losses. A downgrade was imminent. Then, on November 3rd, Yamaichi Securities, a Japanese brokerage, collapsed. Market anxiety spiked. Selling pressure concentrated on Yamaichi. Funding became increasingly difficult, rapidly. At this point, a self-led recovery was reaching its limit. On November 14, 1997, Yamaichi had been seeking around $800 million in support for Fuji Bank. But Fuji Bank's response was harsh. Full backing would not be possible. At the same time, foreign financial institutions, including Credit Suisse and Merrill Lynch, also declined. Partnerships were no longer an option. And on that same day, Nozawa went to the Ministry of Finance. In person. For the first time, he disclosed the truth. Hidden losses amounting to $2.6 billion. It was 8 days before Yamaichi's collapse. After reviewing the report, the director of the Securities Bureau at the Ministry of Finance was reaching a conclusion. Yamaichi's overseas losses were enormous. All unrealized losses generated abroad had been routed through paper companies and ultimately consolidated at its overseas subsidiary, Yamaichi Australia. At the time, through Yamaichi Australia, the firm had entered massive transactions with a major bank in Asia. It sold assets to that bank, raising around $3 billion. But their real value was only about $2 billion. The difference, $1 billion, was used to conceal losses. Yamaichi had agreed to buy those assets back at the full $3 billion, a repurchase agreement. And now, part of that financing was nearing maturity. If Yamaichi failed, the buyback would become impossible, and the bank would suddenly be left with a loss of $1 billion. A shock that could destabilize the economy of another country. At the same time, Yamaichi's overseas subsidiaries were also on the brink of collapse. At Yamaichi International in London, access to funding had nearly dried up. If a failure were to occur in London, the consequences would go far beyond Yamaichi itself. Trust in the Japanese financial system could collapse, and with it, confidence in Asia's markets. The impact would not be contained. The United States, Europe, regions with massive exposure to Asian assets, would be drawn in. A global financial crisis was no longer unthinkable. Yet, a legal resolution was not simple. Under Japan's corporate reorganization law, debts would be frozen, and Japanese jurisdiction did not extend overseas. There was a real risk that international transactions would be disrupted. For the first time, a scenario began to emerge. A financial collapse originating in Japan, spreading across the world. At that point, the Ministry of Finance reached a conclusion. There was only one option left: a voluntary shutdown. The plan was to allow Yamaichi to exit the market in an orderly while continuing to repay its obligations. To support that process, the Bank of Japan would provide special funding, a measure designed to contain any disruption to global markets. 5 days after the hidden losses were reported, on November 19th, the director of the Securities Bureau met with Nozawa and delivered the message. There was no alternative. Yamaichi must shut down voluntarily, and the hidden losses had to be disclosed within a week. Following that, on November 21st, a regular board meeting was held. The agenda: to disclose the hidden losses and discuss a recovery plan. But in the end, no conclusion was reached. Then, that same evening, Moody's made an announcement. Yamaichi's bond rating was downgraded from Baa3 to Ba3, 3 notches lower, into junk status, the lowest tier of non-investment grade. And with that, it became inevitable. From the start of the following week, Yamaichi's ability to secure funding, both in Japan and overseas, would be severely impacted. In the early hours of November 22nd, Japan's leading business daily ran a front-page scoop: Yamaichi heading for a voluntary shutdown. For most of the firm, its executives and employees, it was the first time they had heard those words from the newspaper. In that moment, any path to recovery was gone. On November 24th, at a board meeting, Yamaichi decided to suspend operations and proceed toward a voluntary shutdown. It had been just 3 months since Nozawa became president. He appeared at a press conference at the Tokyo Stock Exchange to announce its end. On November 24, 1997, Yamaichi Securities brought its 100-year history to an end. A voluntary shutdown. At the time, Japan was in the midst of a financial crisis. Banks, securities firms, one after another collapsing. An extraordinary situation, even in historical terms. The system stood on the edge of a chain reaction. And what the government feared most was this: no one knew who would be next. In the end, a decision was made to protect not a single company, but the Japanese financial system as a whole. In dealing with Yamaichi's collapse, the Bank of Japan extended special loans, totaling around $12 billion. And yet, this outcome was not inevitable. Yamaichi had multiple chances to turn things around. But the leadership chose a different path. Driven by self-preservation, they pursued unsustainable profits and continued to push losses into the future. Along the way, the very foundation of the company, trust, began to erode. The principles and philosophy that once guided its management were lost. As a result, governance collapsed. Oversight broke down. The organization became one where no one could stop what was happening, and slowly it moved toward collapse. In the end, Yamaichi's downfall may have been the price of refusing to accept its losses. Every collapse begins with a choice.